yeah, we got the final part of the enduring mystery of Jack the Ripper. This is, yeah, this has been fascinating, especially going around the streets, how he does that, showing you where things took place. And yeah, but anyways, we're on suspect number 2. So yeah, let's go.
Joseph Burnett was the man who lived with Mary Jane Kelly up until a few days before the murder. He and Kelly had supposedly met around April of 1887, and they eventually moved to 13 Miller's Court. Burnett was employed as a fish porter, but for reasons unknown, he lost his job between July and August of 1888. From that point onwards, the couple struggled to pay rent, and Kelly resorted back to prostitution. Now, those who believe that Burnett was the Ripper view his loss of employment as a turning point. The argument is that Burnett was so overcome with guilt and anguish for driving Kelly back to prostitution that he went on a murder spree, murdering one local prostitute after another in a desperate attempt to frighten Kelly off the streets. While most of this is...
Or to make sure she's got all the customers. Just saying.
Pure speculation, it is true that Burnett disapproved of Kelly's prostitution. You may recall that Burnett separated from Kelly on October the 30th because he disliked the prostitutes with whom she associated. Kelly never went on the streets when she lived with me. She would never have gone wrong again, and I should never have left if it had not been for the prostitutes stopping by the house. This might further explain why Kelly was the Ripper's final and most viciously mutilated victim. The implication being that Burnett felt rejected by Kelly and wanted revenge for the breakup. According to Burnett, he did pay Kelly a visit on the evening of November the 8th, but they had parted on quote, friendly terms. He then supposedly went home, played a card game until 12:30 before going to bed. Now, Kelly is presumed to have died in the early hours of November the 9th, so Burnett could have returned to Miller's Court sometime after midnight. While the police did subject him to 4 hours of interrogation, Burnett was ultimately released without charge. Then there's the matter of the locked door. When the police arrived at Miller's Court, they had to force the door open with a pickaxe. This raised an important question. How did the killer lock the door behind him? According to Burnett, the key to room 13 had been missing for some time. Because of this, he and Kelly would, quote, open the door by reaching through the broken window. The door was said to be equipped with a, quote, catch lock, and evidently locked itself upon being closed. If that's true, mystery solved. But even if the door was not self-locking, there's still an obvious solution. All the killer would have had to do is observe Kelly using the window trick and then employ that same technique to fasten the door upon leaving. But those who favor Burnett as the Ripper offer yet another solution. The key never went missing. Instead, Burnett is said to have stolen the key and then used it on the night of the murder. These solutions are all equally valid, and it's impossible to know which one is correct. There is a slight variation of this theory which states that Burnett did murder Kelly but was not the Ripper. Instead, he merely emulated the Ripper to deflect attention away from himself. Once again, this is pure speculation, but the murder of Kelly did somewhat differ from the rest in that it was committed indoors. Burnett remained in the East End until his death in 1926 at the age of 68. While it's only natural for suspicion to fall upon witnesses and acquaintances, Victorian detectives did pursue other lines of inquiry. One prominent theory was that the Ripper suffered from insanity, and a prime suspect in that category is Aaron Kosminski. The Whitechapel murders investigation was overseen by numerous high-ranking officers within the Metropolitan Police. One of them was Assistant Commissioner Robert Anderson. Upon his retirement, Anderson repeatedly and unequivocally stated that Jack the Ripper had been identified. There was no doubt whatever as to the identity of the criminal. Without disclosing the name of the suspect, Anderson described him as a, quote, low-class Polish Jew who was, quote, safely caged in an asylum. He'd been identified by a witness who was described as, quote, the only person who ever had a good view of the murderer. This unnamed witness had supposedly refused to testify because the suspect was, quote, a fellow Jew. I am almost tempted to disclose the identity of the murderer, but no public benefit would result from such a course. While Anderson never revealed the name of the suspect, his colleagues were a bit more forthcoming. Chief Inspector Donald Swanson revealed that his surname was Kosminski. Yet another high-ranking officer, Melville McNaughton, described Kosminski as a homicidal and misogynistic resident of Whitechapel. Surviving records show that an Aaron Kosminski was admitted to a psychiatric hospital in 1891. Aaron was indeed from Poland, he was Jewish, and had lived in Whitechapel. He suffered from auditory hallucinations and a paranoid fear of being fed by others. He was trained as a barber, but had, quote, not attempted any kind of work for years. It's unclear when his mental health began to decline, but upon being institutionalized, Aaron was deemed to be harmless. He was, quote, quiet and well-behaved, and, quote, apathetic as a rule. Only on rare occasions would he get, quote, excited and violent. However, before his confinement, Aaron had once threatened his sister with a knife. The case against him largely hinges upon the claims made by Anderson, Swanson, and McNaughton, especially the claim that an unnamed witness identified a suspect named Kosminski. But the descriptions of that suspect are not entirely consistent with Aaron Kosminski. For instance, McNaughton stated that the suspect had been, quote, removed to a lunatic asylum about March 1889. Aaron was first confined in 1891. Swanson wrote that the suspect had been, quote, sent to the asylum and died shortly afterwards. Aaron was still alive at the time and spent nearly 3 decades in psychiatric care. As such, it is possible that the suspect Kosminski was someone other than Aaron Kosminski. It's also possible that these inconsistencies were mere lapses in memory. After all, these events were recounted years or even decades after the fact, and McNaughton even confessed to writing solely from memory. Regardless of the suspect's true identity, Anderson was the only one who seemed convinced of his guilt. McNaughton ultimately favored a different suspect and stated that, quote, many homicidal maniacs were suspected, but no shadow of proof could be thrown on any one. Inspector Edmund Reed was of the same opinion. Now we have Sir Robert Anderson saying that Jack the Ripper was a Jew. That I challenge him to prove. I challenge anyone to prove that there was a tittle of evidence against man, woman, or child. So when Anderson wrote that there was, quote, no doubt whatever as to the identity of the criminal, he merely expressed his personal opinion. There was in fact ample doubt and no consensus amongst the police. But in recent years, Aaron Kosminski has been resurrected as a prime suspect due to a controversial DNA analysis. Okay, so back in 1888, Acting Sergeant Amos Simpson is said to have stolen a blood-stained shawl from the crime scene of Catherine Eddowes. This shawl was then passed down from one generation to the next before being submitted for DNA testing in 2011. DNA samples were extracted from the shawl and then compared against maternal descendants of Eddowes and Kosminski. In both cases, it was a match. If the subsequent news coverage is to be believed, the mystery has now been, quote, definitively solved. Aaron Kosminski was Jack the Ripper. But as you can imagine, it's never quite that simple. First of all, the provenance or chain of custody of the shawl is severely lacking. There is no evidence of a shawl being found at the crime scene, nor is there any evidence of Simpson ever being at the crime scene. Furthermore, a destitute woman like Eddowes is unlikely to have owned such an expensive item. Second of all, the type of DNA used to identify Eddowes and Kosminski was
It's mad, isn't it? It's mad how it's like everything is questionable to do with this case. It's crazy. But I suppose that's coming from years ago as well, isn't it? So it's like hard to today prove something that happened then. But yeah, let's go.
Mitochondrial DNA, the powerhouse of the cell. This type of DNA is passed down through the female line and is not unique to any one individual. Thousands can share the same mitochondrial DNA, which means it can't be used to pinpoint a specific person. In the words of a geneticist, based on mitochondrial DNA, one can only exclude a suspect. So to say that the mystery has been definitively solved is widely inaccurate. There's still plenty of room for doubt. So to recap, a suspect named Kosminski was identified by an unknown witness. This was enough to convince at least one senior officer of his guilt. That suspect may have been Aaron Kosminski, a man who was largely non-violent but once threatened his sister with a knife. Aaron can neither be incriminated nor eliminated by the DNA evidence. He spent the rest of his life in psychiatric care and died in 1919 at the age of 53. Kosminski was not the only suspect advanced by a high-ranking officer. A completely different suspect who still falls into the same category is Francis Tumblati. Two days before the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, an American physician named Francis Tumblati was arrested in London. As you can probably tell from this photograph, Tumblati was quite an eccentric character. He was born in Ireland around 1833, but was raised in the United States. From an early age, Tumblati gained a reputation for being a medicaster or quack doctor. He engaged in all sorts of medically dubious practices and advertised himself as the Indian herb doctor. He promised to cure anything from dyspepsia and scurvy to cancer and blindness using nothing but medicinal herbs. When he was not posing as a doctor, Tumblati was busy running from the law. He was either accused or convicted for crimes like theft and assault, attempt to induce a miscarriage, and manslaughter of a patient. He was even implicated in the assassination of US President Abraham Lincoln, but was ultimately cleared of suspicion. Now, in the early 1860s, Tumblati is alleged to have hosted a lavish dinner party in Washington. Only men were invited to this dinner, and Tumblati had supposedly expressed fierce hatred of women. Furthermore, he showcased a cabinet in his office in which he stored a vast collection of jars filled with anatomical specimens, some of which were said to contain the wombs of, quote, every class of woman. In 1869, Tumblati ventured across the Atlantic and visited England for the first time. By his own admission, he roamed the streets of London until he became familiar with every part of it. He advertised himself as the great American doctor and had a few skirmishes with the police. After a few more voyages between the old world and the new, Tumblati found himself in London in the autumn of 1888. The purpose of his visit and whereabouts at the time of the murders are completely unknown. Tumblati never stayed in one place for long and made frequent use of false names. There is a story of a mysterious lodger leaving behind a blood-stained shirt near the murder site of Elizabeth Stride. This supposedly happened on the night of the murder, and some believe that this lodger was Francis Tumblati. But there is no firm evidence of that, and the entire incident is fraught with uncertainty. What we do know is that Tumblati was arrested in London on November the 7th. According to the press, as well as Tumblati himself, he was arrested on suspicion of being Jack the Ripper. 2 days later, Mary Jane Kelly was found brutally murdered, and it's unclear whether Tumblati was still in custody or had already been released on bail. Nevertheless, he was ultimately charged with 4 counts of gross indecency, which had nothing to do with the murders. But Tumblati had no intention of standing trial. Instead, he made his way across the English Channel, boarded a steamship under a false name, and fled back to America. He was pursued by detectives and kept under surveillance, but his offenses were, quote, not extraditable. As such, Tumblati remained in the United States and never returned to England. So to recap, Francis Tumblati was a misogynistic medicaster who was in London at the time of the murders. He even showcased a collection of wombs, and the Ripper did indeed extract the womb from 2 of his victims. I mean, he sounds like the perfect suspect. Perhaps a bit too perfect. There is no doubt that Tumblati was in London in 1888, but the claim that he was a misogynistic collector of human body parts is extremely dubious. It can be traced back to a single article from December of 1888, featuring an interview with a man named Charles Dunham. Dunham had a long history of spreading misinformation and has been described as a pathological liar, a forger, and a conman. He was even convicted of perjury. As such, there is every reason to believe that this story is a complete fabrication.
See what I mean?
Furthermore, Tumblati was both older and taller than the men described by most witnesses. Tumblati was said to be, quote, an enormous man who liked to dress in flamboyant and militaristic outfits. It's difficult to imagine a tall, pompous American sneaking around the streets of Whitechapel virtually undetected. On the other hand, it's unclear which, if any, of the witness accounts can be trusted. Then there's the matter of the rings. You may recall that 2 brass rings were stolen from the body of Annie Chapman. It's suspected that the rings were taken by the Ripper to be kept as trophies. Now, upon his death in 1903, Tumblati left behind a quite impressive estate. But among his many valuable possessions were a pair of inexpensive imitation rings. Could they have been the same rings taken from the body of Chapman? It's possible. It's also impossible to prove. Chief Inspector John Littlechild regarded Tumblati as a, quote, very likely suspect. And it's not difficult to see why. If the many rumors about him are to be believed, Tumblati had both opportunity and motive to commit the murders. But therein lies the problem. Much of what we know about Tumblati is founded upon unsubstantiated rumors. Tumblati himself was an attention-seeking charlatan with no qualms about lies and deception. With a suspect like that, one can never be certain where the lies end and the truth begins. To theorize about the identity of Jack the Ripper is to navigate a minefield of hearsay, sophistry, and contradictions. Entire encyclopedias have been dedicated to the compilation of suspects, and with every passing year, they seem to grow ever more expansive. Even though there are hundreds of potential suspects, only a dozen or so are worth more than a brief consideration. Some of the more sensational contenders include famous authors and artists, as well as high-ranking officers and members of the royal family. But these grand conspiracies and elaborate deceptions seem hopelessly contrived against the sheer simplicity of a suspect like Charles Lechmere, an unassuming delivery man on his way to work. Personally, I remain unconvinced that Jack the Ripper has even been identified as a suspect. The few covered in this video are probable candidates, but it's still possible to make persuasive arguments against them. The same is true of all those left out by necessity. None of them can offer anything more than ambiguity and circumstance.
Yeah. It is amazing that that's still the cause of such intrigue, that case. But then I suppose it's everything humans like murder. People love serial killers, which is just weird. But I do. I love, and I don't know why. I mean, not so much love, but it's a fascination with them, I think. Um, but it is amazing that Jack the Ripper still has that. I mean, even the name Jack the Ripper, it's just such a great mystery, really. Yeah. But he is right. It could have been anybody. Like in London, it shows like London is like there's probably 100 times the population that there fucking was then now. So now, like, you'd get away. But then I suppose now they've just, you know what I mean? It's very hard to get away with anything nowadays once they start looking into the CCTV and all that now. Yeah. But still, Jack the Ripper is it's just a classic, isn't it? It's like it's almost perfect. It could be like a story, like a novel or something. Jack the Ripper. And I think that's just what it is. It's just the gruesome things done mysteriously. Something about that just people love. But yeah, that was that was a good one. That's probably one of his best ones. I've got some other ones that people have said, the Lost Colony of Rock, something like that. Yeah, so we got more LEMMiNOs coming, but yeah, that's the Jack the Ripper one done. Yeah. Anyway, that's the reaction. Sweet.